About a month ago, I had an opportunity to fulfill my civic duty by serving on jury duty. And it really was a pretty intriguing experience. It's just kind of interesting to see a courtroom case unfold on something other than a half-hour TV show or hour-long TV show. Some similarities, but definitely some differences as well. And it was intriguing for me, too, being on the jury to kind of observe on a 12-person jury being made up of strangers for the most part, just seeing how we interacted with one another and even seeing how that interaction kind of changed and evolved over the course of a week. It was a week-long trial. But it was, the trial itself was a civil trial, so two sides were arguing their case. And as things went along, both the plaintiff and the defense called a therapist to the witness stand. They each had different ones. And so, and without going into a whole mountain of details, both therapists were providing an opinion about the plaintiff regarding his past and current psychological state. But as these two therapists were each called to the witness stand, both of their testimonies began in basically the exact same way. So the first one would come up, the first one, the plaintiff called their therapist to the stand, and for the first 15 or 20 minutes, the attorney questioned the therapist basically about their resume. They spent 15 or 20 minutes going through the therapist's resume. So they asked questions about his schooling, they asked questions about his practice, they asked questions about any continuing education he'd had in the years since his degrees, they asked questions about any national panels or studies that he's been a part of. Basically, by the end of that 15 or 20 minutes, I felt like I knew as much of his educational background as I knew of my own. I mean, it was very thorough in the questioning. And then when it came time for the defense and they called their therapist to the witness stand, the same thing ensued all over again. 15 or 20 minutes more of going through that therapist's resume, detail by detail, line by line. Why did they do that? I mean, why did we have to spend all of that time? I mean, he could have just come up and said, this is Dr. So-and-so, he's a therapist, and let's go right into the details of the case. But they spent all that time really establishing both of these people's credentials. Why did they do that? And really what it came down to is both the plaintiff and the defense, they wanted us as the jury to view their witness as educated, as knowledgeable, as trustworthy, experienced regarding the matter that was at hand. I mean, they wanted us to completely trust anything that came out of their witness's mouth. And so that's why they spent all that time establishing their credentials. I mean, it was really essential to their case, and so they wanted us to know that we could believe each one of those therapists. And it's a bit like what we're going to be doing this morning during our time together. We're continuing in this sermon series as we journey through the I am statements that Jesus made in the Gospel of John. And so today we're going to continue, as Tim said when he was reading, today we're going to continue in John chapter 10, which is where we were last week. And so last Sunday, if you remember, we talked about how Jesus said he was the gate. This Sunday we're talking about how Jesus says that he is the good shepherd. The good shepherd. And in an attempt to convince you that we ought to follow Jesus as the shepherd of our lives, I want to spend time this morning examining why we should follow Jesus as our good shepherd. I want to show you that Jesus is experienced and is trustworthy, is completely qualified to be your shepherd. In essence, we're going to go through Jesus' resume a bit this morning and then get into, okay, now that we've established that, what do we do with all of it? But first, let's get up to speed from last week. So if you weren't here last week, or if you forgot just the riveting sermon that the pastor delivered last week, then as I said, we were in, well, really, if we go back 2 weeks ago, we started in chapter 9 of John, where Jesus says that he is the light of the world. The light of the world. And of course, he went on then to heal this man who had been born blind. And as the story unfolded, we saw that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, really had issue with that. They had a problem with the miracle that Jesus performed. They had a problem with anyone who wanted to be a disciple of this Jesus. And so as a result, as they were interrogating this formerly blind man, as it became clear that he was a disciple of Jesus, as this formerly blind man began to lecture the religious leaders, they threw him out. They threw him out of the temple, they threw him out of the synagogues, they threw him out of corporate religious life of Israel. And so then Jesus spoke with the Pharisees in John chapter 10, which we talked about last week, and Jesus says that he is the gate for the entrance to the sheep pen. The religious leaders had been the ones attempting to decide who was in and who was out, who was and who wasn't a part of the religious life of Israel. And really, in attempting to guard access to the synagogues and guard access to the temple, they were attempting to guard access to God himself. And what Jesus went on to tell them is that he said, I am the gate. I am the gate to the sheep pen. It is only through me that sheep enter and exit the sheep pen. It is only through him that a sheep was or wasn't included in the sheep pen. And then, in fact, Jesus went on to compare the religious leaders to thieves and wolves, which, again, I'm sure they appreciated so much, being called thieves and wolves who entered from outside of the sheep pen, who sought to get in by another way. And so then what we talked about is that this was all a metaphor, that the sheep pen, robbers, gate, it was all meant to display a larger truth. That truth was that through Jesus and only Jesus can we enter the sheep pen which symbolized salvation. It was only through Jesus. There's no other way to enter that pen. And then upon entering that sheep pen, we find that we are blessed with protection and with flourishment that we talked about last week. And so as we get to today, what we see is that Jesus is not just the gate to the sheep pen, he is also the shepherd. He's the shepherd who cares for and leads the sheep. And again, before I say, well, hey, this should be the shepherd of your life, Jesus ought to be the shepherd of your life, you ought to follow him with your life. Before I tell you that, I want to go through his resume. I want to look at why should Jesus be our good shepherd. And what I want to share with you this morning isn't my own opinion. We're going to look at what Jesus said about himself. We're going to let Jesus share his resume with us, and then we'll make our decision based on that. So if you're not already there, John chapter 10. And we'll start with verse 1, so you can follow along with me. John 10, verse 1, it says, Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Now, I don't know if you've been to the 4-H fair here in Woodford County or anywhere else. I actually grew up in Livingston County, but I grew up in a chicken raising family. So we took chickens to the fair. That was part of my summer every year, was taking chickens to different fairs. And when we would arrive at the 4-H fair or any other fair, what we wouldn't do was take our chickens to some just wide open barn and just kind of throw them in there with everybody else's chickens, so that you would go in and have, hundreds of these things just kind of roaming freely. What you would do is you'd show up and there'd be all these individual pens, and you'd put your chickens in there, and then the be labeled with, the name of the person and the breed and any other pertinent information. But they were in individual pens, and as far as I could think, every other animal at the fair, it was handled the same way. You had your own pen or your own stall or whatever the case might be. You never just went there and threw them all in together. And really, when you think about it, the setting in which Jesus made this statement, the shepherds in a town did not all keep their sheep in separate pens and pastures. Okay, so you didn't have John's pen of sheep over here and Timothy's pen over there, and you didn't have Michael's pen of sheep at the top of the hill. Quite often, what would happen is you'd go into the town, and there would be one communal pen somewhere in that town. And what would happen then is at night, each shepherd would bring their sheep to that communal pen for safekeeping at night. We kind of talked last week about how you have to do that because sheep wander, and we talked about during breakfast how they all went off the cliff that one time. And so they would all bring their sheep to this pen, and then there would be a gatekeeper, which was the analogy that Jesus used last week. And the gatekeeper, who was either hired to do that, he would make sure that nothing came in that wasn't supposed to come in. He would make sure nothing came out that wasn't supposed to come out. And then in the morning, when it was time to gather the flock and go graze on the hillside, the shepherd would return. He would call out his sheep by name, and his sheep that were all mixed in there would know his name, would recognize his voice, and would come out. They would follow the shepherd out. And so that is the picture that Jesus is referencing when he makes this statement about the fact that he is the good shepherd and that he calls out to his sheep by name. Now, the shepherd treated the sheep very differently than a thief or a robber would have done. So the shepherd, as we said, called out to his sheep. The shepherd beckoned his sheep to come. And then again, because they knew their shepherd, because they knew his voice, they would hear it and then they would follow him. The thief would have done exactly the opposite. The thief would not have come to the sheep pen and announced his arrival. Would not have come and called out to the sheep. Quite opposite, would have snuck into the sheep pen, trying to remain undetected by the gatekeeper, but also by the sheep, and then would seek to snatch a sheep against its will and take it out of the sheep pen. Very, very different methods of operation there. And so as we think about this picture, I think there's two things that we can take away from this. You can see the first one on the screen up there, that Jesus openly calls out to us, while our enemy is deceptive in how he interacts with us. So Jesus calls us. Our God does not attempt to trick us into following him. Our God does not attempt to force us into following him. He doesn't manipulate us into following him. Jesus calls out to us freely, openly, transparently. You think about John, who wrote this gospel. He also wrote the book of Revelation. And in Revelation chapter 3, we get kind of another picture of this principle. In Revelation chapter 3, when Jesus is speaking to the church at Laodicea, he says, in verse 20, he says, "I stand at the door and I knock." I stand and I knock. And then Jesus says, those who hear his voice and open the door will be the ones who eat with him and experience his presence. So basically, Jesus doesn't kick down the door. He doesn't bring a battering ram and crash in through the door. He stands and he knocks and he waits for the door to be opened. He waits for us to freely respond to his voice, or the knock in that instance. So the good shepherd doesn't enter the pen and have a rope and seek to, tie up a sheep and then bring it out against its will. He simply calls out in a transparent manner, and then the sheep respond to his voice and follow after him. Which again is very different than the thief or the robber, very different than Satan, our enemy. If Satan came to the sheep pen and called out to us, what does verse 5 say? It says that we would never follow him. We don't recognize his voice. Satan can't come openly and transparently to us and wait for us to freely follow after him, because we would never do it. We would never do it. That's why he must disguise himself. That's why he must pretend to be somebody that he's not. That's why he must sneak around. I mean, no one would willingly follow Satan if they knew what it would cost them in the end. No one would do it. Satan has to be deceptive in his philosophy and how he seeks to go about things. He can only get to the sheep through deception. It's the only way that he can do it. Our shepherd does not come to us in deception. He calls out to us. He comes to us openly, transparently. He has nothing to hide. He has nothing to hide. And so we can trust our good shepherd, first off, for that reason, because he comes to us openly. He calls out to us, unlike our enemy who seeks to sneak around and deceive us, trick us into coming after him. So we can take that from those first 5 verses. And the other thing that we can take from them is that Jesus leads us. We see that when the shepherd calls out to his sheep, the sheep come out, and then the shepherd leads those sheep. So Jesus doesn't move his sheep by driving them. Driving a herd requires that you get behind them and then force them to go or not go in a certain direction. That's a common way that you can move cattle and other herding animals, and you can even move sheep that way. You could move sheep that way. Sheep dogs do that. They drive sheep. But Jesus, our good shepherd, does it differently. He leads us. He doesn't drive his flock. He's not behind us with a whip forcing us a certain direction. He calls out to us and calls us to follow after him. In other words, he won't take us any place that he's not been before and that he's not currently going. He's always right there with us. I mean, this is one of the wonderful truths of the incarnation. I mean, that the Word became flesh, dwelled among us, and leads us. He's the good shepherd who leads us. So because Jesus is fully human himself, he doesn't ask us to go anywhere or do anything that he himself has not already done. He won't lead us anywhere where he's not going to be right there with us every step of the way. Think about Hebrews chapter 2. There's a verse that speaks about this really just in terms of temptation. It says, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he's able to help those who are being tempted. And it speaks to that truth that Jesus went there first, and now he leads us through that. The call of Jesus, when you go through the Gospels, what is the call of Jesus? Especially to the fishermen and to others. He says to come what? We can say, come follow me, right? That's always his call. Come follow me. Come follow me. We can trust our good shepherd because he's out in front. He's leading the way. Right? When he called Peter out of the boat, Jesus wasn't in the boat and told Peter to get out of the boat. Jesus was out of the boat already and told Peter, come out with me. And when Jesus tells us to take up our cross daily and follow him, we do that as he has already done, as he has already taken up his cross. We do that after his example. So again, why should we follow the Good Shepherd? Not only does he call out to us in transparency, but he also leads us. He's out in front, walking ahead of us. Skip down with me to verse 11. So verses 7 through 10 is where we were at last week, talking about the gate. In verse 11, Jesus goes back to talking about being the shepherd. He says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. So a new character enters the story at this point. The hired hand is introduced to us. So in those days, if you had an entire herd of sheep and it was from that herd of sheep that you made your living, it made perfect sense that you would be a shepherd. But if you only had a couple sheep that provided, wool and milk only for you and your family, it didn't make much sense for you to spend all day, every day, caring for just those few sheep, right? The return wasn't worth the investment in that situation. And so in that case, what you would do is you would hire someone from within the community to take care of that sheep. And quite often, families would pool their resources and hire the same person to care for all of their sheep. And so that's the hired hand. That's the hired hand here. He's only in it for the money. It's not his sheep that he's caring for. He's being hired by potentially a number of different people to care for their sheep, to look after them. So he didn't own the sheep. He didn't have as much concern for the safety and well-being of the sheep as the owner would have had. So you can understand why a person in that situation wouldn't even think twice about running away when the wolf would attack the flock. I mean, why would he place himself in harm's way to protect him? It was just his job. It was his 9-to-5 job or whatever. Why would he give his life for that? After all, they weren't his sheep. He was just the one looking after them. If you've ever read in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 34, it contains really a scathing rebuke which God spoke through Ezekiel to the religious leaders at that time. And it was around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. And in that chapter, the religious leaders are called shepherds. They're called the shepherds of the people of Israel. But what we find out is that they were shepherds that did not take care of the flock. They only took care of themselves. And so when you read through that chapter, verse 3, for example, says, "You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock." Verse 6 would say that they let the flock wander on every high hill. And as you read through the Old Testament, when you hear that phrase, high places, what that often was that's where idol worship took place. They would set up different places on the hills, on the top of the hills, to worship these idols. And so this picture of letting the flock wander on the hills is that picture of letting the flock wander into idol worship, basically. The religious leaders were letting the people of Israel do that. And so that chapter, they are brutal words spoken against the religious leaders. And God warned them in that chapter that they would be held accountable for their handling of the flock, because they were, in essence, functioning much more like a hired hand than they were like a shepherd. They cared about themselves. They were in it for themselves. It was about their own wealth and their own power and influence. It wasn't really at all about the people, about the flock that they were supposed to be taking care of. Now, I was talking last week with another pastor about the title pastor. It really can be kind of an awkward title sometimes. The word pastor is a Latin word that means shepherd. I mean, it just means shepherd. And so, it's kind of awkward in the sense that, I stand up here as a pastor, but I am just as much a sheep as anyone here. I am as prone to wander as anyone here. I am as in need of a shepherd as anyone here. So at times it's just kind of weird and uncomfortable to be called pastor when you think about what it means. But the truth is that although pastors are sheep, we've also been called by God to care for, to teach, to give ourselves for the church body. And so, as awkward as the title pastor can be, it's also ought to be a reminder to me that I am to function like the good shepherd. I am to function like an under shepherd, emulating the good shepherd, not the hired hand that doesn't care for the flock, that only looks out for themselves, but like the good shepherd. That's something that the religious leaders had definitely lost sight of in Ezekiel chapter 34. So you can pray for myself and Pastor Tim and Tom's here today. You can pray that we would not lose sight of that we would remember that to be called pastor really means to be emulating the Good Shepherd. You can pray for our elders that we would not lose sight of that. And really, as we carry out the Great Commission from Jesus to make disciples, we are all under shepherds in some area of our life. And so really, you can pray for yourself that you would carry out that role, that you would emulate the Good Shepherd, that you would care for the flock as he would care for the flock, not like the hired hand. But regardless of how the religious leaders acted in Israel, regardless of how some pastors can act today, Jesus is not the hired hand. He is most definitely not the hired hand. He is the Good Shepherd, without a doubt. He has so much concern for the sheep. I mean, what does it say in verse 11? That he lays down his life for the sheep. He lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus does not place his own comfort or his own safety ahead of us. He treats us with an incredible amount of value. Really value worthy of people who are created in his own image, in God's image. He laid down his very life for us. And even within the whole sheep-shepherd metaphor, even within all of that, that is still a crazy idea when you think about that. I mean, let's be honest. An actual shepherd in that day would not have given his life for the sheep. He wouldn't have. It's a no-brainer. People are more valuable than livestock. People are more valuable than sheep. And a shepherd would have known that. Even though the shepherd would have had much more care and concern for the sheep than the hired hand would have, he still would not have gone to that extent to care for his sheep. He would not have given of his very life for the sheep. But Jesus is no ordinary shepherd. I mean, he is the Good Shepherd, as he says here. So if we keep asking that question, well, why should we follow the Good Shepherd? Because he lays down his life for us. He did lay down his life for us. He sacrificed his very self for our own well-being. And then one more thing here, verse 14. Jesus continues on. He says again, I am the Good Shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. So the last thing to focus on here is the fact that the Good Shepherd knows us. He knows us. We've talked before about this Greek word for know. The Greek word used here is gnosko, and it doesn't just mean that you know somebody's name or you know where they live or you know what kind of car they drive. I mean, this is a knowing that is deep and rich and intimate. This Greek and the Hebrew word that pairs with it, yada, it's the same thing. It's this deep knowing. It's a knowing that only exists in a vibrant relationship with another person. So I think I've said before, this is why in Genesis chapter 4, some translations will say Adam knew his wife Eve. Instead of saying like they lay together or were intimate together, it just says Adam knew his wife Eve. It's the Hebrew word in that instance, but it's talking about this deep, rich, intimate relationship together. And that's what is being communicated here in John chapter 10. We are told that the Good Shepherd knows us, and that in turn we know him as well. I mean, those are both pretty incredible. I mean, it's one thing that we can know God. I mean, through the Holy Spirit's work in our lives, we can know more than just some simple details about God. We can truly know God. We can know who he is. God opens himself up to us and allows us to know him in that deep, meaningful, intimate way. I mean, that's what's awesome, is that relationship that we can have now is going to continue for all eternity. We will be plumbing the depths of that relationship forever on the new earth. But as crazy as that is, that we can know God, I think it's even more incredible that the Good Shepherd knows us, knows every single detail about us, past, present, future. And yet, all the things that we just talked about are still true. The fact that he lays down his life for us, he calls out to us, he leads us, those things are all still true, even though he knows everything. He knows every evil thought that I've ever had, and he still calls out to me and wants me to follow him. I mean, he knows every single time I've given in to temptation in my life, and he still gave of his own life for me. I mean, this is incredible. I mean, find me another shepherd like that. And I feel comfortable saying that because you're not going to. There is not another shepherd like that. And so this is why Jesus is not just a shepherd. He's not just a good shepherd. He's the good shepherd. He's not to be confused with anyone else. We shouldn't confuse him with the thieves and robbers. We shouldn't confuse him with the hired hand. We shouldn't even confuse him with the other shepherds. He sets himself apart in the way he cares for his flock. I mean, the relationship that he enters into with his sheep is one of deep intimacy. I mean, look again at verse 15. He compares it to the relationship with his Father. He says, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. Now, there are plenty of things we don't know about the Trinity, but I do know this. The relationship within the Trinity is one of incredible depth and incredible intimacy and love and knowledge among all three persons. I mean, the type of relationship that exists within the Trinity is what every other relationship is supposed to look like. That's what it's supposed to emulate. And yet, Jesus says that our relationship with him is similar. He compares it to his relationship with his Father. I mean, that should humble us, I think, but probably make us ecstatic at the same time, right? I mean, humble us that we even have the opportunity to know God in that kind of a way, but yet then be ecstatic that God wants that with us. I mean, this is crazy to think about. So again, why follow the Good Shepherd? He knows us completely. He knows us better than we know ourselves, and yet all of those other things that we talked about are still true. He still calls us, leads us, gives himself for us. So that's the resume of the Good Shepherd, if you will. So why follow the Good Shepherd? And again, we talked about last week, we are like sheep. We do need someone to lead us. We do need someone to provide for us. We do need someone to protect us. So why follow the Good Shepherd? I would say because all of that, because of what Jesus revealed to us this morning in John chapter 10. And when we talk about following the Good Shepherd, it's not a one-time thing. It's not a one-time decision where I say, "Oh yeah, I want Jesus to be my shepherd, of course," and then we just go on and do whatever the remaining years of our life. I mean, you think about the picture with the sheep. The sheep had a daily decision to make, did they not? Every morning, the shepherd would come to the sheep pen and call their name. And every morning, the sheep had a decision to make. Am I going to hear that shepherd's voice and follow him today? Every morning. And isn't it the same for us? Isn't that a daily decision for us as well? The shepherd calls out to us each and every day, and it's not just a one-time decision. Yes, Jesus is my shepherd, I'll follow him. It is a daily decision. I mean, there will be some days where the shepherd will lead us to a new pasture where we've never been before, and we must make the decision, am I going to follow him? There will be some days where the shepherd wants to lead us farther away from the sheep pen than we've ever been before, and we have to decide, are we going to follow him? And there may be days where we can just hear the wolves howling outside of the sheep pen, and we got to make the decision, are we going to follow our shepherd and trust him to protect us? Trust him as he leads us and guides us. It really is a daily decision, each and every morning. But as you wake up every day and as you're faced with that question, will I follow the Good Shepherd today? I think all you got to do is remember the resume that we talked about this morning. Remember who the Good Shepherd is, that he calls out to us in transparency. He leads us. He goes on ahead of us. He gives of himself totally and completely for us. Totally and completely. And he knows us totally and completely and still does all of that. I guess I'll end by drawing your attention back to verse 10 of John chapter 10. This was where we ended last week as well. Talking about how the Good Shepherd has come that we may have life and have it to the full. That's what the Good Shepherd leads us to. Life to the full. So the question is, will we follow the Good Shepherd today and every day, knowing that it is life to the full that he leads us to? It's not just a little bit of life, and it's not just life that's a little better than it would have been without him, and it's not even life that's better than most. Jesus, as our Good Shepherd, leads us into life to the full. Life to the full. So the question is, will you follow him? He has presented himself to us in this chapter. Will we follow him each and every day? Would you stand with me as I close us in prayer? God, I thank you for this picture that you give to us in John chapter 10. We talked about last week, it's not easy for us to think of ourselves as sheep. We don't like to think about people that need to be provided for and need to be protected and who are prone to wander and who really are defenseless. God, but we know that we are in need of a shepherd. And I thank you that you aren't just qualified to be our shepherd, but that there is none more qualified than you. Thank you for the picture that you paint for us this morning as we look at this chapter. And so, God, I pray that we would wake up each morning with that thought on our minds, that we would know that it is a daily decision whether or not we follow after you as you call out to us. So, God, I pray that you'd give us the strength to do that, the wisdom to do that. It's not always easy to follow you, especially when we don't know where you're going, especially when we don't know why you're taking the route that you are. We always have lots of questions about things in our life, but you're the Good Shepherd, and so we can trust you, and we can lead you, we can follow you as you lead us, knowing that it's life to the full that you have in store for us. So God, as we close this morning and take some more time to focus on you and worship you through singing, I pray that truth would sink in deeply within us. I pray that we would view you as you truly are, the Good Shepherd who knows us and leads us and calls out to us and lays down your life. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.